I don't have compassion fatigue. I really don't. But I think, like many people, I'm starting to get a little crisis fatigue. 5 years ago, we had Hurricane Irma, and if you lived east of the river and east of 41, you were hit extraordinarily hard over here and in this area. And then the year after Hurricane Irma, I had pretty serious health issues all year. I was in agony and pain all year. It took them forever to find out what was wrong with me. And turns out I had 4 herniated discs that were rubbing up against my spinal cord. And I spent a lot of time in bed and on ice until they finally did the surgery. And then voila, after the surgery, I felt much better. But it was a time of some crisis there for me. And it was less than a year after that till we went through COVID. And COVID was the single most, I think you'd ask any of our elders or staff, I think COVID was the single most difficult thing we ever went through. It was it was divisive on every level. And at the same time, I was on the board of a Christian school, and that was even harder because we had parents saying, if you don't keep school open, we're taking our kids out. If you keep school open, we're taking our kids out. And I mean, so we all remember what all the COVID issues were all about. And then, of course, right after that, we have another Category 4 hurricane, which is the worst one that has hit this area. And if you're west of 41 or west of the water, you probably have had significant damage. So I don't have compassion fatigue. I'm thrilled to be able to help folks when they're hurting like we've had, but I do have a little bit of crisis fatigue. And crisis fatigue is the kind of thing that can change the way you think. So I'm preaching this morning to myself. I usually do. I've told you that before. I usually preach to myself, and then I figure I'll slap a bunch of you in the process. And so I'm preaching this morning to myself. I really will, about reminding myself to think about how I think. To think about how I think. There's a story about a man and a woman who were taking a cross-country trip, and so they divided up the driving duties and divided all the other duties, and they had sort of a plan, and every time they'd pull into a gas station to get gas, the one who was driving would pump the gas. The other one would go, they had this down to a science. The other one would go to the bathroom and come out, wash the windshield. And then they were ready to go. So they saved twice as much time in their little process. So it was the wife's turn to go to the bathroom. She went to the bathroom. She came back and started washing the windshield. And he'd already finished pumping the gas. And he's sitting inside the car ready for it to run. And as she's washing the windshield, he said, "It's not clean. It's still dirty. Wash it again." And so she dutifully takes some more of the liquid and washes the windshield. And he said, "It's still not clean. Don't you know how to wash a windshield?" She didn't say a word. She goes and gets in the passenger side, pulls a tissue out of her purse, takes off his glasses, wipes the lenses on his glasses, puts them back on, and voila, what do you know? The windshield is clean. It's been wiped. And it just goes to show you how much our perceptions change our view of the world, even when they're wrong. What do you see when you look out your eye lenses at the world? Do you see the proverbial glass half full or half empty? When setbacks get you down, do you quickly get back up, or do you start thinking failure? Do you start the morning with a sour outlook on the coming day, or do you tell yourself, "This is the day the Lord has made, I will rejoice and be glad in it," as the psalmist said? In other words, another way of thinking about that is, do you start each morning by saying, "Good morning, God"? Or do you say, "Good God, it's morning"? See, your brain is processing every bit of that. What you say to yourself and what you think has an impact on what you do and how you live. It simply does. So we will have a better chance of solving problems and being faithful if we will control our thinking. And that may be the single biggest reason you get better or you get worse. Let me ask you a personal question. What do you think about the most? What do you think about the most? What are you thinking? See, my goal in this lesson, and we won't be in here too long, my goal in this lesson is to do exactly what Peter said his goal was to his readers. This is my second letter to you, dear friends, and in both of them, I have tried to stimulate your wholesome thinking and refresh your memory. My goal today is to, first of all, not fall down with whatever that is, there, that little hook. And then my second goal is to stimulate your wholesome thinking. And so the first thing I want to point out from the text we're going to look at this morning is our thoughts create our emotions. Would you say that sentence aloud with me, please? Our thoughts create our emotions. One more time. Our thoughts create. They really do. They really do. A first century Greek philosopher named Epictetus said, men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. And that has repeatedly proven to be true. He understood that in every situation, our response is based on how we choose to interpret or think about a situation or a circumstance. And that choice creates the emotions that lie around it. What Epictetus thought, he had discovered, I think, from Solomon in the Old Testament, who long ago wrote, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Now, there's a written record in the Old Testament that clearly proves this principle. There's a man in the Old Testament named Jeremiah. He's known as the weeping prophet. And one of the reasons he's known as the weeping prophet is because the siege of Jerusalem and the captivity of the Jews to the Babylonians happened during his time of prophecy in 586 BC. And so he's not only weeping about that in his historical account of the book of Jeremiah, but then there's a book after that called the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And Lamentations means to grieve or to be sad. And indeed he was. And so we're going to read a few verses today where he is so depressed. And I mean, that's putting it mildly. If he wrote these words today, he would be institutionalized. If he wrote these words today, somebody would call the authorities and say, hey, this guy wrote this stuff on Facebook. This guy wrote this stuff on Twitter. You better keep an eye on him because he's somebody that might just do something horrible. Starting with verse 1 of chapter 3. I am the one who has seen the afflictions that come from the rod of the Lord's anger. The Lord has led me into darkness, shutting out all the light. He has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. So, what misery and hopelessness is in these words, and what makes it worse is that he believes God's doing it. He believes God is the one causing his mental and emotional and physical symptoms here. And then he has further physical symptoms as well. In verse 4, he said, God is, now notice he's saying he has. He's not saying the situation has, the circumstances has, or I have. He's saying, God has made my sin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with anguish and distress. He has buried me in a dark place like those long dead. God has walled me in, and I cannot escape. He has bound me in heavy chains, and though I cry out and shout, He has shut out my prayers. He has blocked my way with a high stone wall. He has made my roof crooked. You literally need to remember that Jeremiah is blaming God for all these symptoms. God is shutting out his prayers. God is blocking his way. God is making him feel trapped and hopeless and out of control. This is all God's doing. Keep in mind, not once does he ever say in this little journal, what I'm thinking is contributing to this. Now, I want you to really remember that because that's going to come in handy in just a few minutes. He goes on. He has shot arrows deep into my heart. My own people laugh at me. All day long they sing their mocking songs. He has filled me with bitterness and given me a bitter cup of sorrow to drink. He has made me chew on gravel. He has rolled me in the dust. This guy's suicidal, don't you think? Or maniacal, one or the other. Peace has been stripped away, and I have forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I had hoped for from the Lord is lost. Wow. How he wants to grovel in his misery. I mean, that's worse than just about anybody I've ever seen, and I've seen some pretty bad. So, how's he going to get out of that kind of thinking that is stinking? How's he going to do it? Here's the worst part that's coming up. You say, worse? There's something worse than that. What could be worse than that? What's worse than that is, he's the reason he's thinking that way. And he's about to tell us in the next two verses. Verses 19 and 20 say, the thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Did you notice that? Not a word, not a word, not a word about his thoughts when he was going through all of his miseries, all of his sufferings, all of his problems, all of his suicidal thoughts. Not a word about his thinking about that. And then he says, just the thought of my suffering is bitter. I will never forget this awful time. So I've told you many times before, I think the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, is the most accurate to the literal translation. Many of the other translations that we use the most, the NIT, and we use more here than anything else, the NLT, are more readable, but probably the most accurate to the exact text is the Revised Standard Version. And here's what it says about verse 20. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down with me. Oh, now all of a sudden, we've got to a place and to a point where we all can identify with this. Has your soul ever continually dwelled and thought about something? Mine did just 2 nights ago. I'm serious, just 2 nights ago, I laid awake in bed without going to sleep for 3 or 4 hours with my soul continually troubled about a matter having to do with the church. And I hate to say I've done that through much of my life. I can suddenly identify. I couldn't identify with the other 12 verses we've read very much, but I can identify with that one. You can let your soul continually think about something until it just weighs you down and ties you down. No wonder he's depressed and discouraged. It's not just the events in his life that is causing it. Now, really important. Watch what happens next. Watch what happens next. He has finally realized that he's having these problems because of his thoughts. He's thinking about it all the time. And so he changes his thoughts and he calls to mind something totally different, something positive, something faithful, something hopeful in the very next verse. He does that. Yet, that's always a transitional word, yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in him. Did you see it? Did you see it? Jeremiah moves from the pit of total depression and despair and perhaps suicide to the searing mountaintops of faith that gives us songs like "Great is thy faithfulness" and "the faithful love of the Lord never ceases." And he does that in a moment of seconds, a matter of seconds. And he does it because of one reason and one reason only. He changed his thoughts. His thoughts were continually weighing him down. He was continually thinking about all of those problems he had just expressed with us. And then he changed his thoughts. That is the sole thing that happened. Nothing had happened in Jeremiah's external world between verse 19 and verse 24. What had happened was in his internal world. His thoughts had changed. Our thoughts, my friends, create our emotions. They also affect our behavior. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the name Nick Sitzma. Nick Sitzma, about 70 years ago, worked for the railroad. He was a worrier. He was nervous, and he was a worrier all the time, but he worked for the railroad, and one day he climbed into a refrigerated boxcar, and the door shut behind him and locked, and the train took off. And Nick Sitzma sat down, freezing to death, and began to think, if I don't get out of here, I will die. And so he beat on all the walls. And finally he realized what was about to happen to him. And so he wrote out a message inside to his family and friends about what had happened to him and how he was sorry and the things that he was sorry for. And he made every kind of noise he could within the car to try to attract anybody's attention. And then finally, he hopelessly lay down and died on the floor of the railroad car. The next morning, the attendants came to the car and the workers and opened it up. They looked in, they saw Nick, they knew him. They saw him on the floor of the car. He looked like someone who was dead. They went and checked him. He was dead. He looked like someone who was frozen to death. The problem was the refrigeration units on the car had never been working. That's why the repairmen were coming to the car that morning. They were coming to fix the refrigeration units. The temperature inside the car never went below 40 degrees and was in fact above 50 degrees when the other railroad workers found him. The man died because he thought he was freezing to death. Our emotions are determined by our thoughts. And in turn, our thoughts affect our behavior. It's not just what is occurring in our lives that affects our behavior, it's what we perceive about what is occurring that matters. So is Cindy Laird here? Cindy, are you here? Raise your hand if you're here. She's always here. There she is. There's Cindy Laird back there. All right, so 2 Saturdays ago, the first Saturday after the hurricane, we came up here to the building to work, a bunch of us, to unload 2 trailers from Nashville Disaster Relief and put supplies in order. And I was trying to help as best I can with everybody else pick up stuff. I didn't want people to think I'm as old as I am, and I didn't want people to think that my back hurts as much as it does, and I wanted to look like I was, stupid stuff we think like that. And Cindy looked at me and said, I really wish you'd quit. First of all, aren't you supposed to be on vacation? And I said, yes. And she said, well, I really wish you'd quit doing this anyway, picking up this stuff and moving it. We can do this. You do other stuff. And then she said, Cindy, shake your head if you remember this. She said, you look pale. She said, you look pale. I felt great. I was working out. I work out. I do a 45-minute workout 4 or 5 days a week. I know I don't look like it, but I do. And I felt great that Saturday. But she said, you look pale. So I got to thinking, well, man, God is my witness. He's here, I think, somewhere in here too today. Steve Caldwell walked up to me 5 or 10 minutes later. He said, look, there are other things you can do. We don't want you hurting your back. And besides that, you look pale. I felt fine 5 minutes earlier. 5 minutes later, I was ready to call 911 and check myself into the hospital. Your thoughts affect your behavior. You see, if we focus on the facts related to an out-of-control world, we will behave in a certain manner. Now, some of you were still laughing, and God knows I'm glad about that. But then you missed the last sentence I just said. Our thoughts affect the way we feel and process an out-of-control world. This world is out of its mind. This world is out of control. There is stuff happening in our country right now that I'm just glad my parents are dead. Because if they saw some of the headlines about some of the things that are being done in our country, we are in an out of control world, but our thoughts affect our behavior on those things. And if we focus on a world that is out of control because it's so heavily influenced by Satan, then we are going to be discouraged and depressed all the time. And if we focus on in a world that is under control of an almighty and all-powerful and sovereign God, then we will behave in a different way. We will behave in a different way. I can give you a perfect example of that. I can give you an absolutely perfect example of that. All I got to do is go to Numbers chapter 13. In Numbers chapter 13, well, I got to get past the thing I skipped first. In Numbers chapter 13 is the story of Caleb and Joshua, and there were 12 spies that God sent into the promised land that he had already promised the people he was going to give them. And all they had to do was take it. That's all they had to do was take it. And so they went into the promised land, and 10 of the 12 spies came back and said, the people there are like giants. They were the Nephilim. They're like giants, and not only that, but we're like grasshoppers in their sight. Well, is it indeed a land flowing with milk and honey and all sorts of natural resources? Yes, it is. It is all those things. It's everything God told us, but we could never do it. We could never conquer them. That's what 10 of those spies said. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, we should go up at once and conquer the land. God will give us the victory. Now, you see, the other 10 were focusing on an out-of-control world. Like many, I suppose the ratio today is about the same, actually. The other 10 were focusing on the out-of-control world, all the things that go wrong in this world over here that we think Satan is in control of, and he's only influencing it. He's not in control of it. And these two, Joshua and Caleb over here, they were focusing on God and what God is in control of. And whether we realize it or not, that's everything, because Satan has already been defeated at the cross. And so do you know what happened? Every single one of those spies, along with the people followed the majority, which they often just foolishly do, and every single one of those 10 spies and everybody over the age of 20, everybody over the age of 20 were left to wander in the wilderness and die and never see the promised land. You know who went in? Joshua and Caleb, the two positive spies. Now, where are you? Are you focused constantly on because your thoughts control your behavior. Your thoughts control your emotion. So where are you? Are you focused on an out-of-control world, or are you focused on a God who is in control of everything? So we're rushing to a close, so I've got to make one last very important point that I want you to make application with. We create positive change in our lives by gaining control of our thoughts. The battleground that I just described between God and Satan is primarily our minds. This is why we are told in 2 Corinthians 10, we are human, we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. And see how important this is. Would you read that last sentence aloud with me, please? We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. Wow. If we couldn't do it, he wouldn't have told us to do it. We can do this. We can do this. If our thoughts are creating our emotions and our thoughts are creating our behaviors, then we can change our emotions and our behaviors by changing our thoughts. That's exactly what Jeremiah did that we looked at earlier in the message today. And what Jeremiah did, we can do too. Now, how do we do that? Two more quick scriptures and then we close. Philippians 4, 6, and 8. The thoughts that enter our minds are to be examined and evaluated in light of this verse. And if they are, then the promise in this verse is that the peace of God will guard our hearts, which is the seat of our emotion and our thoughts, and our minds. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. And His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. And so, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on things that are true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about these things that are excellent and worthy of praise. And so I've often used this verse, as I've told you many times before, as my prayer of the heart. I'll pray it in the morning, asking to God to not let me be anxious about anything, but instead pray about everything, and God guard my heart and my mind through Christ Jesus, as you've done. Very simple, just like that. You don't have to have it word for word. Very simple. I repeat it over and over again, 15, 20 times, till it is saturated into my brain for that day. And as I've told you, every time I've preached on the prayer of the heart, miraculous stories about what happens. It always works. I don't always work, but it always works. And then one more verse. Romans 12, 1 and 2. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind that he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. And now if you'd read this next line with me. You don't have to read the last line, just this next sentence. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. What? Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Don't get caught in the trap of irrational, negative, or faithless thinking. Don't be conformed to the behavior and customs of this world, or as Phillips' translation says, let the world squeeze you into its mold. Instead, let your thoughts control your emotions and thoughts control your behavior, and both control your thinking so that God can make a new you out of you just by changing the way you think. You say, it sounds good, but your house wasn't destroyed in a hurricane. No, but my son's was. And I've been with him and his family for the last 3 weeks. Feels like 3 years, but 3. No, I'm kidding. They moved out last night, and Diane said, I bet they're at home over there in their rental place going, man, am I glad to get away from them. No, your circumstances, none of us have experienced circumstances like Jeremiah did. None of us have, not a single one of us. And we heard how depressed and suicidal he was. And we saw that one thing changed him, one thing, by changing what he thought about and how he thought about it. If it happened for Jeremiah, it can happen for you and for me. So that's my challenge to you today. Take the Word of God and implant it into your heart and your mind and your soul so that it will, as the first verse we use, 2 Peter 3:1 says, stimulate you to wholesome thinking and change your whole life by changing just the way that you think.